Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. So last episode, we were looking at American campaigns and the type of digital outreach they're doing, both within social media, but also outside. In this episode, we're going to take more of an academic focus and look at what is the research coming out on political targeting, or what is more commonly known as micro-targeting. But some people have an issue with that term because you're not targeting at the individual level, but mostly the group level. So we'll stick with the term targeting for now. But my guest to discuss this is Professor Sanne Kruikemeier. She is a professor of digital media and society at Wageningen University and Research. I apologize to our Dutch listeners for my pronunciation here, but Professor Kruikemeier's research has focused recently on political targeting, both in terms of what campaigns are doing, but also in terms of how are voters perceiving the democratic implications of targeting. So there's a difference between what is the effect of a targeted ad on a voter in terms of persuasion and mobilization, and what does it mean that voters are thinking about what targeting does for democracy? How does that affect their trust in the process as well as their political interest? So we'll talk about that and two other studies. The first one we'll discuss is really interesting because it's a team of researchers that interview digital campaigners from 6 different countries: the Netherlands, US, UK, Australia, Canada, and Germany, to try to figure out what's going on with targeting and how does targeting fit into the overall data-driven strategy of political parties across different political systems. And that's really important, as we'll discuss in the episode, because targeting strategies might differ based on whether you have a 2-party system or a potentially 37-party system, like in the Netherlands. Then we'll move on to talking about Professor Kruikemeier's research on perceptions of targeting and what that means for democracy. And the third study we'll discuss looks at the actual ads sent out by various political actors, parties, super PACs, NGOs, and particularly focuses on the issues that are in those ads. How do parties communicate, for example, issues that they own, like social spending on the left or law and order on the right, versus wedge issues that are really those divisive issues that are controversial for voters? And what research tends to suggest are the issues that you need to hit if you want to persuade voters to your side. So there's a lot in this episode. We don't dive super deep into these studies, but there'll be a link to each of them in the episode description. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Sanne Kruikemeier. Again, she is a professor in digital media and society at Wageningen University and Research. Professor Kruikemeier, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Looking forward to talking to you.
So one of your main research interests is data-driven political targeting. And before we get into some specifics from those studies, I'd like to ask you about your current take on targeting at a more theoretical level, because I think for a long time the discussion was, targeting can be bad if it spreads disinformation, but it can be good if it gets people interested in politics. And I'm just wondering if that distinction is still the one we should be thinking about, and how are you approaching targeting currently in your research?
Yeah, I think we often talk about the dangers of targeting for democracy. But if we think about especially also the normative and theoretical discussion, I think we should move to these conditional effects, because we talk about it as having an impact on democracy, but it's very diverse, of course. I think it's important to look at different countries, a different context, but also for whom. We see some evidence that some people are more likely to be influenced by micro-targeting than others. So I think it's really important to look at these more conditional effects. And I think we also need to look at, move a little bit from that normative discussion to more empirical evidence, right? To really understand to what extent does targeting really have an influence on people, and also in which context, for instance, in which countries and for whom.
Yeah, and so for some of our listeners who are maybe not so prepared in statistics, what is a conditional effect? How might targeting be conditional upon certain characteristics?
So we look a lot at the US, right, about targeting, but I come from the Netherlands, and they have so many different parties. I think in the last election, 37 parties were competing. So it means that if you target people with different ads from different political parties, there are different circumstances you have to account for, right? For instance, you might want to collaborate with other parties, right? So if you attack one party, which you later on want to collaborate with, it makes it more difficult, right? So there are different circumstances that political parties need to account for in these elections, compared to a system where you just have two parties, for instance.
Interesting. Yeah, I know the Netherlands had some issues last election in forming that governmental coalition. So interesting to think about, how negative can you be in a campaign when you might have to have a coalition partner in the future?
Yeah, and also we see, for instance, some evidence in research that some people are more likely to be affected by political ads. For instance, those who are have less knowledge, for instance, about politics. So that means that I think it's important to look at who are the people who are more likely to be influenced by political ads. I think this is an important question for future research, for instance.
Definitely. And I think, as you were saying, the conditional part is important, particularly taking it outside of the US. And so, in a study that you've recently published with a team of academics, you looked at data driven targeting practices across 6 countries: the Netherlands, US, UK, Australia, Canada, and Germany. And so, can you outline a bit of your approach there in terms of what you and your colleagues were trying to find out?
Yeah, very much interested in how do political parties use data-driven campaigning in their in the election campaign. I think it was interesting because these countries are, of course, different with regard to political systems, with regard to media systems. To understand a little bit how, what role data-driven campaigning plays. I think what is really important here is also these dynamics I talked about before. Is that, for instance, in the Netherlands, because you have all these different parties, the dynamics are different than, for instance, in the US. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, because you have so many different parties, it's interesting to see how also like smaller parties try to use data-driven campaigning, which have less funding, for instance. So how do they do that, right? Compared to more bigger parties, where there's more financial support or people who can help out with the campaign.
And you talked to, was it digital campaigners from all those different countries?
Yeah, we worked with a lot of different researchers and they all talked to different political parties. So it was nice to actually use all this information that we have in these different countries, where a lot of researchers talk to different campaigners to see what is the difference here. So it's basically, trying to find out if we can combine all the insights that we have into one analysis, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, micro targeting or targeting is kind of the thing that people think about when they think about, what is social media bringing to election campaigns. But I think your study showed that targeting is just kind of one part of the overall data-driven campaigning. So could you outline some of the key findings from those interviews? And in particular, what role did targeting play relative to the kind of overall data-driven campaigning?
I think what we found is that data-driven campaigning was often that manifests in all these different campaigns. So we see that they build a lot on existing techniques they already have, which are far less sophisticated than often assumed. So if you think about the public discussion about micro-targeting, it feels a little bit like this decisive force in election campaigns where you can really manipulate people. However, if we look at the evidence, which is actually there, they often lack the capacity to execute like these hyper-intensive practices of data-driven campaigning. So in that sense, we were seeing it's more of an additional factor in the campaign next to a lot of other activities political parties do during an election campaign. However, some of these interviews were done during COVID pandemic, and there you saw that a lot of parties also had a lot of money left because they could not, for instance, use any other way of campaigning. So they used a lot of data-driven campaigning because that's the only way they could campaign. However, in general, we see that data-driven campaigning is more of an additional technique in like the toolbox that political parties say they have.
Interesting. So during COVID, maybe they were saving on things like hotel expenses and travel, and then could use that money instead on digital outreach.
I have that feeling a little bit, but also because they struggle, right? So in the Netherlands, there was also like a big political crisis, and it was difficult also to maneuver the campaign a little bit because they needed to. There was a very unclear when the campaign was starting, so that's what we saw a little bit in the Netherlands.
Interesting. So we talked to a campaigner last time on the show who was talking about the difference between like a high level American campaign, like let's say Joe Biden's campaign, versus like a local race. And I think that's kind of the American comparison to like small versus large parties in the Netherlands, like you were discussing. And so I'm wondering if, from what you've looked at, either in your research or just kind of what you know through talking to these campaigners, kind of what is the difference, or I guess the level of sophistication between a smaller party versus one of the more larger mainstream parties?
I think compared to local, I think what the big upside is of campaigning or targeting on, for instance, Facebook or other social media, is that you have the GPS data, right? For local parties, that's like a big difference. So even with like a very small budget, you could really easily also set up this campaign. So I think for local parties, it's a perfect way to reach their potential voters, because you can basically locate them, which is, I think, the big difference. So I think for a lot of local parties, they are trying to use it in this way. And for bigger parties, we saw with, like, for instance, our data is that parties have different strategies. Because in a two-party system, you can try to focus, for instance, on certain messages or certain political parties. However, in the Netherlands, there were like 3 different strategies. So one is targeting basically everyone, right? So you try to reach as many people as possible using targeting campaigns. The other one was really trying to mobilize your own electorate. We saw that, for instance, with the Green Left Party in the Netherlands. They really tried to reach their own voters. And the third one was that one party in particular, also on the left, tried to reach another party, which was also on the left, but close, and tried to target that type of voters. So these were the 3 different strategies we found basically in the Dutch election.
Mm. And when you're comparing these different countries, and particularly parties in Europe versus parties outside, I'm just wondering, because you mentioned GPS data. I mean, what effect are you seeing that GDPR is actually having in terms of these party strategies? Because you often talk about the U.S. as being this Wild West. So much data is being bought and traded to use for building lists and whatnot. So, I mean, are you seeing an effect of GDPR in the Dutch context or Europe more broadly?
When we talk to parties, I mean, parties struggle with that, right? Because also what parties struggle with most is that, for instance, if you are a party which values privacy a lot, but you also want to use targeting, that's a little bit difficult, right? Because using targeting also means that you use a lot of private data. So I think it's also an internal struggle for a lot of political parties, in this sense that what do you do, right? If you value this, but you also value privacy, but you also want to use targeting a lot. And on the other hand, we see, I'm just very curious about maybe not the GDPR, but also the Digital Services Act, because here are more specific rules, right, about targeting. So in that sense, I'm really interested in that, how that will play out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what you're saying about if you value privacy, but then you get caught in a sort of, Cambridge Analytica like scandal, that can really undo your political legitimacy. Whereas if it's not an issue for you, maybe it's something you can overcome. So in terms of, the effect of these targeted messages on voters, as you said, there can be differences in different voters, but I think the evidence is coming out that, at least in the US, these ads don't seem to have too much of an effect, maybe a fraction of a percent on turnout. But I think there's a difference between the effect that these ads have on individual voters and then the effect that targeting as a practice has on what people think about modern democracy. And this is something that you've looked at in the second study that I'd like to discuss, where you try to get at what is the effect of targeting on people's perceptions of democracy. And you look at this through what's called the third person effect, which I think is really interesting. So can you describe what the third person effect is and how it might relate to democratic trust when it comes to political targeting?
The third person effect, I also like this idea, but the third person effect is media is affecting others, but not oneself. And this is a very common thing we not saw only with targeting, but also before, when television became popular. I think, oh, it will be so devastating for our democracy, and people will only just watch this. And or for instance, with gaming, people are only gaming, become aggressive. But people are affected, but not me. And this, I think, what we also saw with political targeting, right? So, for instance, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal came out, this is such a big danger and can really change election campaigning or elections or, the results of an election. However, if I see an ad, I'm critical, so I'm not affected by this, right? And I think this is the third person effect in short and related to political targeting.
Yeah. And so in the study, you were looking to test specifically how do these like third person effects of targeting, right? People think, okay, it's not me that's being affected, but everyone else in democracy must be being affected. And you wanted to look specifically at democratic trust and political interest. And so I'm curious to ask why those two variables.
Yeah, you would assume that if you think that targeting influences others, you might think it might be a big danger for democracy. So it might erode trust in democracy. While on the other hand, if you think about political ads and you see them during an election campaign, and you think, oh, this is interesting, it might also instigate some political interest, right, in certain topics, or so it can have this diverging effect, right? On the one hand, it can erode trust, but it can also might make you as a person feel more interested in politics, for instance.
Yeah, and I'm thinking also about this idea that, having 37 parties in the Netherlands, and if they're all targeting and they're kind of going into the same marketplace to buy slots for Facebook advertising, maybe that might make political ads more interesting, right? Because there's a competition element where if you have to compete with 36 other parties, your content has to be good. And maybe that might work to increase political interest as well. I don't know if you have any insights on whether parties have to be more competitive in their online ads because there's more parties, perhaps?
Yeah, they try to be original, right? So I think what we see is that they try to use humor, for instance, or try to make like certain like shorter quotes. However, that's also what we discussed with the other authors in the paper we compare to different countries, is that it's often also a person standing in front of one certain phrase, right, about a certain topic. It's also not that sophisticated, but they try to use, for instance, techniques from more marketing insights, for instance, using a lot of people, smiling people, and that draws attention, right? So, and I think this is what a lot of parties do, try to be also more positive, for instance, and try to get the attention from viewers online.
Yeah, so you can see how maybe if you have a smiling politician, that could kind of make people think that it's being manipulative and losing trust in democracy, but also making them more interested in politics more generally. So you designed a survey to test how perceptions of political targeting affect trust in democracy and political interest. And you ran this during the 2019 Austrian elections. So could you describe a bit the setup of that survey for us, as well as what you found?
Yeah, but what's really important is if you study something during an election, it's always to do that in a more, we call it longitudinal way, so over time. So you use two data points, and then you can see if people change in between those periods. And then we can really understand if, for instance, people's interest levels change or their trust levels change. And this is really important if we do studies during an elections to see if there is any change during the entire campaign. So basically that was the setup. And the findings that we found is that we indeed found a little bit of this effect, right? That targeting or the techniques that are used are often also frightening people a little bit, and it might have an effect on trust in democracy. However, it can also have a positive effect on your interest. And I think it's important to understand also these positive effects, because we tend to focus a lot on these negative effects. Well, I think that also political targeting is not negative per se. It can also be very positive. For instance, it can make people more interested in politics, but you can also show people more about what is the campaign about, what are the topics that are important, because we are receiving so much information online, offline, it's sometimes difficult to find also these political viewpoints online. So I think it's also a way to inform the public about the issues in the campaign. So in that sense, I think it's important that we also focus on the opportunities that targeting can bring.
Definitely. Now, going into the weeds a bit, and this is something that it's difficult as I don't do so much survey research. It's hard for me to understand exactly how this kind of shakes out. But basically, you find that perceptions of targeting affected trust in democracy sort of negatively, but political interest positively. And these two variables were correlated with each other. So, put another way, political interest and trust in democracy sort of go together, but they relate to political targeting in sort of opposite directions. And you talk about this in the paper, but I wanted to ask you here, how do you interpret this finding? Is it that political targeting lowers trust but increases interest? And is therefore a kind of net zero for democracy? Or how do you interpret the way that these variables are correlated, but moving in different directions when it comes to perceptions of targeting?
Yeah, I think what is important here is that I think we measure two what I think are important variables, right? But targeting can affect people also in more than those two ways, right? So I'm not sure if it will be zero if you sum it up, right? I think we should really think about targeting in ways that it can affect people in different way, right? So it can, for instance, also be polarizing, right? If you target people constantly under specific circumstances, then people might become stronger in their conviction toward a certain topic. Maybe, for instance, climate change, for instance, if you targeted people on that topic very negatively. But on the other hand, it can also, for instance, increase knowledge because you know more about the topic, climate change, or how you can be more sustainable, for instance. Now we looked at these two variables, but I think in future work we should look at all of these influence of targeting, because if we have a complete idea about how targeting works and how it can affect people, not only voting, but also knowledge, polarization, I think then we can also make specific policies to see how we can use it in our election campaigns, not only here and in Europe and the US, but also, for instance, in other countries like India or Brazil or the countries where we assume that targeting might also have a big impact on democracy, for instance.
Definitely, definitely. But let's switch over to talking a bit about the ads themselves. And I know you've been doing some research on this, both in the United States and also in the Netherlands, of course. And the way that you've been approaching this, and I know that there's been some NGOs working on this as well, is that instead of looking so much at the Facebook ad library or these repositories where the platforms actually put these ads, you've been looking at collecting these ads through users who download a plugin that collects the ads as they see them on their Facebook feed. So can you describe a bit the strengths and weaknesses of that kind of plug-in approach versus looking at the ad archives that these various platforms are putting out?
Yeah, I think the archives are amazing because it gives you so much insight, not only from us as researchers, but also for journalists, for instance, but citizens can look information up there. And it's really nice. The problem, I think, with the ad archives is that there are two things, I think. We're not sure they're complete, right? So it's really difficult to check that. And the other thing is that we don't know that much yet. So there is some basic information, right? Targeting information, who is targeting, who you are targeting, right, as a political party. But we don't know the receivers, right? So we don't know that much about those people who receive the ads. And with the plugin, you can combine these two, right? So what we did during an election campaign, we asked people to install the plugin, but we also sent a really long list of a questionnaire, basically, where we asked the participants a lot of information, for instance, their interest, political affiliation, right? So what are the parties they would like to vote for, their age, their income. So we know a lot about these people. So we can really then match basically what the background characteristics of these people are, but also see what the ads they received on the other hand. So the information is much more detailed. And for us, it's more useful when we study, for instance, the actual effects of ads, because we could also ask these same people in the end of the election campaign what they actually voted for. And by matching all of these data, I think we get a more detailed picture than the ad archives.
Yeah, definitely. So you can link the kind of individual level data to the content of the ads themselves. And I'm curious about this because I haven't used this approach myself, but I assume that if you have one of these plugins, that it's also getting all types of sponsored ads, right, from marketers as well. And so I'm wondering if you've kind of looked at maybe what percentage of the ads that people get are actually about politics, because there's been some research using data donations, for example, where people download their Facebook data and send it to researchers. And the amount of political content they're seeing is in the low, maybe 5%, something like that.
Well, that's a good question. We did not do that because the thing is with the GDPR, you also want to only collect the data that you use, right? So we didn't want to keep on all the data there. So we just focused on the political ads. What I think is interesting, though, is that what also maybe that might be a downside of the tracking data. The tracking data is now currently done on desktops, right? But the way people receive political ads is often on mobile phones. So what we did in the studies we did, for instance, also in the Netherlands, is that we had a third part, which was data donations, and not in the way that you download your data, but we asked people during the day to make screenshots of the ads they receive on their smartphones and send it to us. So in that way, we could have a more complete picture of what people received, not only on their desktop, but also on their mobile phones. So the ultimate way of doing this would be to have a plugin, for instance, installed on a mobile phone, but that's really difficult because mobile phones are very much protected in a way to do this. However, by asking people to make screenshots of their ads they receive and send it to us, we could also get like an idea of what information they receive on their mobile phones in general, right? Which is not ads basically. But in this way, we could combine it to get a little bit of a better idea of what people are exposed to during an election campaign. And we know this is a research from my PhD student. She saw, for instance, there was a steep increase of political ads during the election campaign. So it went also up. So we see that during the election campaign, especially the hot phase of the campaign, we call it the last 2 weeks of the campaign, that the exposure was much higher to these ads.
Yeah, I guess that's also maybe one limitation of these ad libraries is that they don't, as far as I know, they don't break it down by mobile versus desktop exposure.
No. And I think this is a big challenge, of course, right? To know what people are exposed to on their mobile phones. And not only social media data, but also of social media or more private data, for instance, WhatsApp data. It's so difficult to research this. And we know, for instance, they play a big role in elections, for instance, in Brazil and India. And it's really difficult to uncover this, especially because it's private communication, right? And this part is really not covered in current research on targeting, for instance.
Definitely, definitely. So I'd like to ask you about the US and then switch over to the Netherlands because you just published a study recently in Big Data and Society where you analyzed targeted messages from the 2018 midterm elections using one of these browser plugin data sets from ProPublica. And I'll link to that paper in the episode description because we probably can't go into all the findings here, but I'd like to ask you specifically about the political issues in those ads because your study breaks down the different actors that they're coming from. So looking at parties versus super PACs versus NGOs. And, was there a huge difference between what these actors were sending in terms of the issues relative to what we might expect from more traditional forms of advertising, like television ads, for example?
Yeah, so what we were interested in were two different things. So we were interested in whether, for instance, Democratic or Republican Party was focusing more on specific owned issues, right? So was it that the Republican Party was more focusing on immigration, for instance, or vice versa? And we saw some evidence of that these parties focusing on their owned issues, but they also focus on different issues. So here we saw some diversification of the campaign. And the second thing we were very much interested in was an idea which is, I think it's rather old. It's from the book The Persuadable Voter. And they use an argument. They say basically, if you want to persuade voters, it's important to focus on people who are conflicted on which issues. For instance, like say abortion. And if you are not, or if your viewpoint is different than in line of the party, then it's easier to persuade these voters with certain arguments if you focus on which issues. And this was the second thing we wanted to study here is, do political parties focusing on these more contested or wedge issues, such as abortion or gun control, and then see if they target more on these specific issues. And we found some mixed evidence for that as well. So it was not that clear cut. But it's, I think, an assumption I want to study more also in the future, to which extent these more contested issues are more likely to be used during an election campaign, especially with targeted ads.
Yeah, and I guess it depends also on the context if you're thinking about wedge issues, because you brought up the example of abortion. I mean, you were looking at this in 2018, whereas later abortion really became one of the primary issues that was discussed. And so I guess the question is like, how do you distinguish between a wedge issue and just one of the most talked about issues, or are those two things different, if you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, it was also difficult to identify them also in the study because what are those actually, right? So in that, and it might also change. And I think that's also what is interesting about targeting campaigns if you follow people over a longer period of time, right? So if this issue becomes more salient, for instance, how does that change people's perception? Do they become more polarized on that issue, right? So does it change over time, right? And is that also influenced by, for instance, ads that you see? I saw that some of these ads on abortion were very emotional, especially in the US context. And if you are targeted with these ads over time, it might make people also more polarized on this issue, right? But we don't know. So it's interesting to I think understand this also in a more longitudinal perspective.
Yeah, and I mean, thinking about wedge issues in the United States, they're relatively easy to identify because it's a wedge between the Democrat and Republican Party, right? Because there's only two of them. Whereas in the Dutch case, having over 30 parties, it might be more difficult to decide what are these actual wedge issues. So in comparing kind of the 2018 US midterm research that you've done and also the 2019 Netherlands election campaign research that you've done, I mean, what are the big differences or similarities that you see in targeting or in terms of issues? Because one has, let's say, two parties and one has 37.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing is the actual impact of these targeted election campaigns. Because what I think is really important is that if we look at all the literature, and you also mentioned it before, right? So we see that there are small effects often of these targeted ads. They can change people's voting behavior a bit. But I think in the Netherlands, for instance, if you change people's the way they vote on another party often because the turnout rates are very high. Well, if you look at the US, the turnout is super important and it can also make a huge difference in certain states. So, although we know from research that election campaign or the way we use targeted campaigns can have a small effect can be very consequential, especially if you can flip, for instance, a state, right? In that sense, small effects become also big effects. So if we think about the effects also in the Netherlands, it might be that people switch votes, but the consequence might be not that large, right? Because they just switch, for instance, to a more neighboring party. While in the US, if you decide to cast your vote, that can make a huge difference in an election also on small numbers. So in that sense, I'm very interesting to see not only the effect on citizens and whether they cast out their vote or vote for a specific party, but also what does it mean for an entire election, right? And who gets elected.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when you talk to campaigners in the US, a lot of times they say, look, people are set on their opinions of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. They're not going to switch from one side to the other, or a very small number of people are. So, in that sense, targeted ads might not have so much of a persuasive effect. But that's interesting. In the Netherlands, let's say you have 10 parties in a block on the left, a targeted ad might have more effect because it may shift a voter from one party to a party who's very similar but might be different specifically on the issue they're targeting about.
Yeah. So in this sense, I think in the Netherlands, the effect focuses more on people maybe switching, right? While the US might not be switching, but it's the turnout is more important, right? So we're talking about different impacts of targeting, which can be very consequential, right?
Interesting. So where are you taking this targeting research moving forward? I'm just curious to hear because you're really on the forefront of people working on this topic.
Thank you. Yeah. So at the moment, we are working on with a team of people working on three different things when we talk about the impact. So one PhD student is very much focusing on what does it actually mean, right? So how much do people switch votes, for instance, and whom? And we found some evidence, for instance, that are this less political, knowledgeable citizens are more likely to be influenced, for instance. There's another person who's in Vienna looking at eye tracking research, which I think is also really fascinating. So they really examine, for instance, are certain ads drawing more visual attention than others? And I think this is really interesting. And another PhD student is focusing very much on how can we make people more sophisticated and to deal with these election campaigns. She develops interventions, right? So campaigns to inform citizens about these election campaigns. And then we have some amazing researchers who work more on also the legal side and also interviewing a lot of campaigners, also in different countries, to make these comparisons, right? Because certain countries in Germany, for instance, are focusing very much more on this privacy aspects of campaigning, and it's very different than, for instance, in the UK. So we also want to find more nuances in these different countries. And I'm very much looking forward to, in my own project, I'm focusing also on India. So I'm really interested in this aspect of campaigning in another part of the world where there are other dynamics which are very important to study this.
Definitely. It sounds like you've got a good, it's more than a triangulation of ways to look at this. So very much looking forward to following your research to see what you find. So Professor Kruikemeier, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
You're welcome. Nice talking to you.
I've just been speaking with Professor Sanne Kruikemeier, Professor of Digital Media and Society at Wageningen University and Research. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll get into the tech policy space with Adam Kovakovich, who heads a trade association for major tech companies, and discuss what we might expect from the 118th U.S. Congress. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melba. See you next time.